Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you again with another APGov video. We're taking another look at topic 5.4, how and why political parties change. And today what we're going to be mostly looking at is how the major parties, the Democrats and Republicans, will be going through what we call realignments. A realignment is when you see a significant alteration of how the party's party makeup will look like, and that's going to be in many cases the result of some type of tragedy, some sort of crisis, or maybe it's just a changing set of values that are going to really transform not just the existence of political parties, but really who's going to be supporting these parties. Because this is something else that you have to kind of keep in mind. Just because a demographic of people support a party for a long time, it could be a century, something could change to either almost immediately change their party support, or it could be something that evolves over a little bit of time that's going to, when you look back on it, will have caused a slow change in that affiliation. And when we talk about these realignments, critical elections, as political scientists define them, are the moment where we see these realignments have now happened. So in other words, the elections are kind of the proof, the manifestation of what had already been recently happening. So we look at, in our American political history, what we call 5 alignments or realignments that exist. And really the first one that we're going to be seeing here is going to be in the 1830s. And this is going to be the result of the impact of Andrew Jackson as president. And one of the things you have to understand, once again, about the impact of Andrew Jackson is that he is considered the first quote-unquote common man president. And that's going to be the result of the expansion of what we call universal white male suffrage. And, as we've said before, back when it was the elites that only had the power to vote, well, they would choose people they identified with, other elites. Well, now that the electorate is now mostly made up of people that are, far less wealthy, far less educated, have far less land, now these candidates are going to have to relate to those people who are now going to be most of the electorate. And Andrew Jackson, of course, is going to be embodying that. And, when we take a look at the election of 1832, you can see Jackson just pummeling Henry Clay in this election. And this is the first time you see Jackson, actually kind of going, mano-a-mano with another candidate for the presidency. Remember, in 1824, we see Jackson in a, 4-way race, which he ends up losing. Then in 1828, it's really a referendum on John Quincy Adams. And so now we're looking here in 1832, which is really the manifestation of, now as a candidate, you have to represent the common person, or at least appear or campaign to the common person. I mean, you can see here Jackson has, pretty much national support. And Henry Clay, who is really more of a throwback in terms of coming from, wealthier status, and appealing to that more of elite kind of sensibility, is now kind of, the dinosaur, so to speak. So that first alignment, in terms of what you got to do now, in terms of being a legit candidate for president, that's going to be the first alignment that's going to be taking place starting in the 1830s. But of course, that won't be the last change. As we go from the 1830s into 1860, there's going to be, of course, a major evolution that's happening in the two parties. By this point in time, it's going to be Democrats and Republicans by 1860 in terms of where you are on the slavery issue. There is no where to go anymore on this. Slavery has become so polarizing. There's no middle ground. You're either in support of it or you're not. And the 1860 election clearly shows where that divide is. And, as you can see here in 1860, you can see the North-South divide and the only candidates that either don't vote for Breckinridge, the Democrat, or Lincoln, the Republican, are folks that are kind of right here in the middle in terms of slavery. And note, even though this starts off as a slavery issue and then, of course, correlates into support for either the Union in the North or the Confederacy in the South, moving forward in the next few years, this alignment is going to define the rest of the century. And for many voters, they're going to remember the Civil War. They're going to remember this election, and they're going to vote accordingly. And it's really going to lead to some very noticeable party loyalties and coalitions that exist. For example, for the remainder of the century, you're looking at Republicans being defined by, small town, rural Northerners, a lot of farmers in the northern half of the country, but also supported by big business owners. Remember, the Republican Party kind of inherited that old Whig Party notion of you got to be supporting business, high tariffs, all that kind of stuff, low to no federal, regulation of business. So this is where the GOP kind of gets, its base of support. But also another key group in the Republican fold at this time are African Americans. African Americans because the Republicans are the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, the party that, tried to, although mostly unsuccessfully, tried to reconstruct the South following the Civil War. And then conversely, you have the Democrat Party that is going to be largely defined by those that supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. When we start to look at the South starting in 1860 and for a long period of time, we're talking for about a century, the southern half of the United States, sans that period of Reconstruction where that was a little unusual, this is going to be owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Democrat Party. It will be known as the Solid South for a century. And, in the immediate time, it's a memory of the Civil War. But over time, it becomes a matter of, well, I'm a Democrat in the 1950s. Why? Because my daddy was a Democrat, my granddaddy was a Democrat, and my great-granddaddy that fought in the Confederacy was a Democrat. So there is that intense loyalty that gets baked in by the time of the Civil War, and it lasts for a good century. Pretty amazing. But note, it's not just Southern supporters that will define the Democratic Party, because in some of these big cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, you are also going to see the Democrats being in an alliance with those Southerners to be able to court immigrant votes as well. So you have some very interesting coalitions that define the rest of the century. Republican, wealthy business owners with African Americans. And you've got immigrants, including Catholics, with, Southerners. So you see these interesting coalitions that are going to define the rest of the century. Now, in 1896, we see the third realignment take place, and this is going to be mostly due to the clear divides in the stances and values of the two candidates in William McKinley, the Republican, and William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat. This election is really going to be coming down to currency, and it's going to be talking about how should our currency be backed, by gold or by silver? Should we have inflationary policies or deflationary policies? Should the government have more control of the economy or not? And this election is going to be crystallizing those differences, especially on the Democrat side. Now, in this election, you're still going to see some of the old legacy from the Civil War, like I told you, the Solid South down in here, and mostly Northern support up here for the Republicans. That hadn't changed that much, but what it really does is really start to crystallize the economic stances of these two parties moving forward, as we still see it really today. The Republican Party being the party of conservatism economically, small government, minimal regulation, actively trying to help business owners with the idea that by helping business owners, you're helping America in general. And the Democrats, which had been a conservative party economically, Grover Cleveland, was a Democrat, but he sent in federal troops to stop the Pullman strike, that now changes. The Democrats have absorbed the Populist Party platform that had threatened their very existence, and now it starts to become the liberal economic party that we recognize it today. from the Bryan campaign, you then get the Wilsonian progressive reforms, and then from there, the FDR New Deal reforms to the, Lyndon Johnson Great Society economic reforms, all the way, up to Barack Obama's, Affordable Care Act. So you start to see, the liberal economic views of these parties, the Democratic Party, and, the crystallization of the conservative values economically with the Republican Party in that third realignment. Now, we then see another critical realignment take place in 1932. Now, of course, 1932 is when we're in the worst of the Great Depression, and we see the American people make a very loud statement in terms of what they want. This becomes a referendum on, in general, do you want an active federal government or do you not want one? Up to this point, yeah, the progressives were making some changes, but still on the whole, America was defined as a minimal federal government entity. Well, that has been destroyed following this realignment in 1932. We as a nation have now discarded that notion, and we've never gone back. I mean, this has totally changed our mindset. We now want an active federal government. It's just how much active, you know what I mean? But it doesn't matter. Everybody wants an active federal government now. Another key thing that's going to be defining this realignment is the almost overnight switching of support of African Americans from the Republican Party, going back to the Civil War, to the Democrat Party. And the vast majority of African Americans still support the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party has been seen starting in 1932 as the party that wants to actively help those most in need. And that's going to, at least for, a while, trump some of the support for, the Jim Crow South. Even though we're still 30 years away from the Jim Crow South ending, we start to see that support shift. So that's going to be critical. And that's going to define kind of the mid part of the 20th century. And then we get to the fifth realignment, which we are still affected by for the most part today. And this takes place in the 1960s. In the 1960s, as we've said before, this is a period of great change and tumult. And one of those examples is the Civil Rights Movement. And you start to see in the 1960s the end of Jim Crow segregation. You see the Voting Rights Act put in place. You see the 23rd Amendment to end poll taxes. And you start to see that it's the Democratic Party that's really making these changes happen. And it's, yes, Northern Democrats like a Kennedy, but you even had, Johnson from Texas signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act into law. And what this does is just create this amazing transition in the South. Now, we had said previously that the South was known as the Solid South, going back to the Civil War, that it was lock, stock, and barrel Democrat. Back in those days, you couldn't get elected dog catcher as a Republican. But now that starts to change. Look at the 1968 election. Just a few years after these civil rights milestones were achieved, you can now see, starting in this election, that only Texas would stay loyal to the Democratic Party in 1968. The rest would either go with hardliner independent George Wallace, and he was a segregationist, or a Republican, Richard Nixon, who had appealed to those that had more conservative views on racial matters. And that marks a transition to what it is today. Today, the South is mostly a Republican stronghold. Now, there have been, there are times where, we've seen some changes, like Virginia's now gone back to being Democrat, and North Carolina is kind of a swing state. Georgia went Democrat in the 2020 election. Florida's kind of bounced around on occasion. But still, the Republican Party is the dominant party still of the South. And that happens because of party switch, party loyalty from Democrats to Republicans, mostly initially due to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party being, on the forefront of racial change and integration. We've also seen, starting with this recent realignment, a desire to not be as loyal to major parties. We see more of a desire to not even affiliate with major parties as much anymore in terms of loyalty. We see more split ticket voting. In other words, you're more identifying with the candidate than the party. So that has led to also divided governments, which we talked about before. So we're still living in the wake of these most recent realignment changes. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.